Good afternoon. My name is Abby Edens. I'm Director of Education at the National World War II Museum, and I want to welcome you to our Lunchbox Lecture Series today. Today's talk, which is entitled Fort Benning and Columbus, Georgia, A Community Transformed, is going to be given by Curator of History, Rebecca Bush, from the Columbus Museum, which is located in Columbus, Georgia. This talk is going to explore Fort Benning's transformation from prior to World War I, during World War II, and immediately after the Second World War, and how that actually affected and impacted Columbus, Georgia, which is called the mother-in-law of the Army. So without further ado, I want to say a special thank you to the Columbus Museum again, and also to Rebecca Bush for giving today's talk, and I will now turn it over to Rebecca.
Hi everyone. My name is Rebecca Bush, and I'm the Curator of History and Exhibitions Manager at the Columbus Museum in Columbus, Georgia. I'm so happy to have been asked to give today's Lunchbox Lecture for the National World War II Museum. Today we're going to explore the history of Fort Benning and Columbus, Georgia, and how these two communities changed each other and transformed during World War II. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. While I'm doing that, I will say that I hope everyone is having a great start to their new year. And there we go. Okay. So to give you a little bit of a roadmap of our conversation today, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the origins of Fort Benning and its longtime connection to Columbus. Then we're going to talk about Fort Benning during World War II itself, including the dramatic physical expansion of post, as well as the many numbers of service members and civilians who arrived to Fort Benning during that time. Those came from several new units, including paratroopers or the Airborne School, the Women's Army Corps, as well as doctors and nurses. We'll talk a little bit about a POW camp for Italians and German soldiers that was housed at Fort Benning. And then we'll explore the influx of soldiers that I talked about, especially as it relates to race relations. That will help us transition into the story of Columbus during this time, looking at local race relations, especially in regards to the USOs and YMCAs that developed during that time. We'll look at the infrastructure expansion of Columbus, which was greatly affected by the expansion of Fort Benning. We'll look at the role that Columbus residents played in creating social activities and hospitality for soldiers who were stationed at Fort Benning. Then we'll conclude by looking at some familiar famous faces who were here during that time, as well as looking at the future of Fort Benning after World War II. Just want to point out today that I will be sharing a number of images from the collections of both the Columbus Museum, the National World War II Museum, as well as the Library of Congress. There's a couple exceptions to those, and I'll point those out as I go through the program. So how do we end up with an Army post in Columbus anyway? This really begins during the Spanish-American War. When the US got involved in this war right at the end of the 19th century, there was not a standing army that we think about having today. And so there was a call that went out for volunteers. An army had to be raised and trained extremely quickly. And to do that, there were a number of training posts that were created to do so. One of those became Camp Conrad, which was located just north of Columbus itself on the banks of the Chattahoochee River, near a large mill there in Columbus. Columbus is actually on the Georgia-Alabama border. So the soldiers that were stationed there could look right across the Chattahoochee River and see Alabama. And Camp Conrad actually didn't last that long in Columbus. It was only here for a few months over the winter. The soldiers who were stationed here by the time they might have even started to think about deploying to Cuba or the Philippines, the war is really over at that point. It seems to have been a very muddy time. However, though it might not have been that exciting for the soldiers, this really captured the imaginations of people in Columbus. There were concerns about law and order, for one thing, that these unfamiliar young men who were coming to the camp might cause problems for the upstanding citizens of Columbus. But the business leaders of the community quickly realized that there was another side effect that happened, a rather positive one, that these soldiers were away from home, they were often bored, but they were being paid, and so they had money to burn. And when they wanted to burn that money, they went into local shops downtown, and they went to local eating and drinking establishments, and they purchased products in shops to send back home or to try to make camp life a little more bearable. So you fast forward about 18 years to the American entry into World War I. As it became clear that the US was going to become involved in the war in April of 1917, local business leaders in Columbus, especially the Chamber of Commerce, began talking about the economic boom that had happened when Camp Conrad had been situated at Columbus. And they began thinking to themselves, wouldn't it be great if we could recapture that now? There still wasn't a standing US Army, a situation that really began to change after World War I. And again, just as we had for the Spanish-American War, you see the Army and the US government working to quickly create a lot of training posts to train new US military members. And many of these were located in the South, largely because of its temperate climate, and also because there were large swaths of agricultural land that the government could purchase quite cheaply. So the Chamber of Commerce and other Columbus leaders began their lobbying efforts in April 1917. There are several trips to Congress in Washington, D.C. that happened. Finally, in the early fall of 1918, so almost 18 months after this project began, Columbus is notified that they have been successful. They will become the new home of the Infantry School, which had previously been located at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. And the first troops arrived to Columbus in October of 1918. Camp Benning was named for Confederate General Henry Benning. It's one of several US military posts named for Confederate military leaders, ironically. However, as you might have noticed by the date, the soldiers who arrive here are really only here for about 5 weeks or so before armistice is declared in Europe. And so again, the men who come here for training, a few of them deploy to Europe in late 1918 and 1919 to help with kind of the wrap up of the war effort there. But there's not a large scale World War I war effort that takes place out of Columbus and Camp Benning. What is different this time, as opposed to what happened after the Spanish-American War, is that the post remains here. Just a few months after its initial home, which was really right on the eastern city limits of Columbus, it moves to a different, larger space a few miles south of town in 1919. Continues to grow and expand there. So the postcard image that you see here, it's kind of, I think we think about a circa 1920 view of Camp Benning. You can see there that this person has annotated where drill fields and officers' barracks have even been added since this photograph was taken. And in 1922, Camp Benning becomes Fort Benning, which indicates that it's really going to be a permanent post and that the infantry school will remain there as an important part of this new effort to create a standing army, a standing military that's really ready to be a show of force if the US has to enter armed conflict again. And I just want to share this quote. It's a rather long quote, but I think it really speaks to the importance of community relations and the relationship between the post and the town that was really present ever since the beginning. S.A. Shipley, who was the Columbus Chamber of Commerce secretary, was quoted in the newspaper during the final week of preparations for these troops to arrive to Columbus in 1918. And he said, "While this is an obligation which we have assumed, we would rather consider it a wonderful opportunity to be of service to our fellow men, and especially to our noble-hearted boys who have joined the colors. Columbus has much to learn in this sort of work, but experience will soon guide the efforts of those who are earnest and unselfish. All of these camp activities, which begin when a camp is located at any point, is usually spoken of under the general term camp community service. This includes all forms of service for the soldiers, such as entertainments, recreation, correspondence and reading facilities, club facilities, etc. The object of all of this is to make the soldiers' stay in camp as cheerful, homelike, and comfortable as possible, in order that their morale may not be lowered and that they may keep in a cheerful and healthy condition." That last line there, the emphasis added is mine, but it really speaks to the attitude that Columbus folks adopt towards the camp and have continued to adopt for the past 102 years now. So skipping ahead, there's quite a bit of activity that happens on Fort Benning during the 1920s and 30s. There's a lot of community engagement there. But by late 1938, early 1939, there begins to be this real expansion at the camp, especially physically. U.S. government and military leaders are watching the situation in Europe, both before and after war breaks out there. And they realize that even before the U.S. becomes involved in December of 1941, for a couple of years beforehand, they realized that this is a potentially explosive situation that the U.S. may enter, even though it's not directly involved in the conflict at first. So they take the opportunity to build up a lot of the military facilities in the country so that they're not caught flat-footed like they were when the country entered World War I. And so during this time, we see this huge building boom at Fort Benning. And so I've thrown some numbers up here. I know it is a lot of numbers, so you can kind of take a look at those as I'm watching. If you are watching this after the Facebook premiere, you can kind of pause it and read to your heart's content. I'll just point out a couple main statistics out of this. In 1940, there were 9,000 servicemen, men specifically, who were stationed at Fort Benning. 2 years later, in 1942, it's up to nearly 45,000. That's 5 times as many people stationed here in just 2 years. The Army created an officer candidate school here, which was graduating 70,000 men. New training complexes were added, so expanding beyond the original main post, which was the hub of activity for the post first 2 decades. Now we've added Sand Hill, Kelly Hill, Harmony Church. Some of those names may be familiar to those of you who may have trained at Fort Benning or had family members come through here. To speak to what I was talking about that huge building explosion that happened, there's 1,500 permanent buildings located on Fort Benning in November 1941. 2,500 temporary buildings had been erected just since 1939. So in 2 to 3 years, 2,500 temporary buildings had been raised on the site. And it may be of interest, some of you may know that several of those buildings, which were only supposed to be in operation truly temporary for about 5 to 10 years, many of those were being used up until the early 2000s. So temporary always has a different meaning sometimes. There are about 7,500 civilians working on post at that point. Fort Benning encompassed 150,000 acres. There's 50,000 houses there. There are 8 bowling alleys, 13 chapels, 8 theaters, 44 PXs, which is an awful lot of PXs. To purchase fuel for all the vehicles that were being used, that was 50,000 gallons of gas a month for 3,000 motor vehicles, plus forage for 150 animals. We have not fully transitioned to a fully mechanized force at this point. And food purchased per month, these are just some of my favorite statistics, again, in November of 1941. We've got 100,000 pounds of dry beans, 500,000 pounds of beef, and 5,000 gallons of ice cream. I'm an ice cream fan, so I definitely approve of the copious amounts of ice cream there. I want to include this image just to show that not all of this construction was done so hastily that there wasn't any aesthetic quality to it. This is a sketch, a cartoon for an altarpiece that was placed in one of those 13 chapels on post. This was actually done by Alan Cox, who later became a muralist, who's well known for the murals in the US Capitol and the US Department of State. However, at the time, he was participating in an artist program that sought to provide traveling altarpieces for men who might be traveling overseas or training at US military posts. So this is a rather large piece, and it's now in the collection of the Columbus Museum. So driving that expansion, or kind of coming as a result of that expansion sometimes, worked both ways, were several new units. And one of those, probably the very best known of those today, was the Airborne School, or the Parachute School. The Airborne School was founded in 1940 by Lieutenant Colonel William C. Lee. He wanted to develop a test platoon of soldiers who would complete missions in part by parachuting out of airplanes into enemy territory. He drew his initial test platoon from members of the 29th Infantry, which was one of the longest serving units there at Fort Benning. They first arrived in the 1920s. And they did quite a bit of work at Lawson Army Airfield, which is a component of Fort Benning. So there at Lawson, they constructed 250-foot jump towers and practiced from those. 3 of those towers, believe it or not, are actually still in use today by the Airborne School. So remember what I said, the structures that are built during wartime often last and have a good shelf life, you might say. The main unit that trained at Fort Benning during World War II becomes known as the 501st Parachute Battalion. There is a separate segregated unit of African American service members who are part of the 555th Parachute Battalion training at Fort Benning. And that group is also known as the Triple Nickels. So I have some images here from the National World War II Museum that kind of spotlight these training efforts. So there on the left, you can see one of these jump towers, the steps up to it. That man there is just starting to jump out there. It's kind of at the top of his descent. Then we have some physical training there on the right. This is kind of more of a general montage, but it looks quite similar to this image here on the left. So here what is happening is these men are strapped into harnesses. They are basically in the parachute apparatus without the parachute being attached. And this gave them an opportunity to practice releasing from the harness and kind of get a feel for what that might feel like when they are in the air, before they actually moved on to jumping out of the air and not having, or having too much gravity sometimes to help them. Gives them a chance to practice with their feet just a couple inches off the ground. And then the image here on the right is really interesting. It's a little bit hard to see what's going on, but it's basically men helping each other practice what happens when they land with their parachutes. So, okay, I've survived the jump, I've made it to the ground, I'm okay, what do I do next? Because remember, the jump is really only the first part of the mission. Once they are on the ground, these troops had specific missions that they were to complete while in enemy territory. So we have a great image of some calisthenics there on the left. I think many of us may do similar exercises now, or if you were a fan of Jane Fonda or Richard Simmons in the 80s, that might look familiar to you. And then a great image here of parachutes, test parachutes, and the planes that they jumped out of. Again, they're at Fort Benning, part of the airborne training. This is a fabric painting in the Columbus Museum's collection by the Atlanta-based artist Don Williams Boyd. It depicts the triple nickels. You can see on the primary jumper's helmet there, if you look really closely in the center, it says 555, his unit number. There's a lot of great information out there about the triple nickels, and I believe in the coming weeks, there may be another lunchbox lecture that focuses on this topic. So look for information about that. Now, the paratrooper unit really captures the public imagination. I really love this doll that's in our collection. This is the Raggy Doodle doll, and he is a paratrooper. You can see him there on the right. He has his goggles, he has his warm cuff to keep him warm as he's jumping from extreme altitude. His harness is painted on his cloth body there. And then behind him, you can't see it in this view, but he has a small bag. And when you get in that bag, you can pull out this enormous parachute. And within that, on that parachute is printed what you see here. This is a detailed shot of the parachute. It says Raggy Doodle, U.S. Parachute Trooper, Fort Benning, Georgia. So the reach of the paratroopers really goes far beyond Fort Benning. People are really fascinated by this idea. So much so that there's a lot of media attention paid. So there are civilians who go up and participate in test jumps to see what it's like. You can see an image of that there on the right from the National World War II Museum, and then from the Columbus Museum's collection, we have the filming of a 1941 movie called Parachute Battalion, which featured Robert Preston as the lead, but excitingly, it also featured several actual soldiers, including the founder of the unit, Lieutenant Colonel Lee, executing the actual jumps that you see during the film. So that's really exciting that the jumps and talents of these original paratroopers were captured on film by Hollywood. So also during this time, and also related to the Airborne School, the Women's Army Corps, or the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, auxiliary is later dropped, comes into being. The WACs, as they're known, are the female Army Auxiliary Unit. A lot of military branches had female auxiliaries during World War II. The idea is that these jobs are for women to do more clerical or office-oriented jobs that free up more men to enter combat roles. So women served as switchboard operators, mechanics, stenographers, drivers, bakers, clerks. In Columbus at Fort Benning, 70 women specifically served as parachute riggers and packers for the Airborne School, which is an extremely important job because if the parachute is not rigged and packed correctly, there is a very good chance you will not be surviving your jump. So many of these women were champion parachutists in their own right. However, the first women to attend and graduate from the Airborne School did not do so until 1973. This one here on the left is actually the first WAC to be named Master Sergeant, and that was at Fort Benning. So from the Columbus Museum's collection, the WAC we see here on the left is one of those airborne WACs. You can tell because you can see the airborne insignia on her cap and on her shoulder there. So she may have been working in a clerical role, or she may have been one of those parachute riggers and packers. On the right, we have a WAC uniform that was worn by a young woman who came to Columbus and ended up settling here later with her husband, who she met in the military. It gives you a sense of what that uniform looks like. And here are some pictures of WACs on the job at Fort Benning. So we have on the left, we have women taking notes, taking dictation, listening to radio transcriptions coming across and taking those notes. The woman on the right, this is a favorite image of mine. She is delivering movie reels to all those multiple theaters that were located all over Fort Benning. We have two women learning to file there with the help of their male counterparts. And then another favorite image of mine, we have the WAC Detachment No. 1 softball team, who were the champs in Fort Benning on 1945 there. You got a little bit of a league of their own feel going on there. So great image there. And of course, the Army Nurse Corps was here as well. We are really fortunate at the Columbus Museum to have a wonderful collection of clothing and photographs and letters related to the service of Dorothy Mosley, who was a native of South Carolina, later married her husband that she met in service, and lived the rest of her life as Dorothy Bacon in Smyrna, Georgia. But she finished her nursing school in South Carolina early so that she could enlist in the Army during World War II and serve as a nurse. So we have both her green service uniform, which you can see there on the left, and then her ward nurse's dress there on the right. There's also a POW camp located at Fort Benning during this time. The camp housed as many as 3,000 Italian and German prisoners from 1943 through 1945. During their time in Georgia, these prisoners constructed new buildings, they worked on railroad lines, and they worked throughout South Georgia and East Alabama as well, helping local farmers harvest peanuts and cotton. There are many POW camps located all over the United States. Some associated with military posts and bases, some not. The camp at Fort Benning really became notable in 1944 when the War Department started this re-education program for the captured German prisoners. This included lessons in reading English and in American history and governments, and it was named the University of Democracy. Almost all the camp's German prisoners signed a pledge renouncing Nazism after they took this course, and so it attracted national media attention, and this curriculum later expanded to several other POW camps in the US. The wooden plate there on the left is in the Columbus Museum's collection. This was a folk art plate that was carved by a prisoner at the camp, and the structure there that is colored in is one of the guard towers of the camp. So here on the left, we have Italian POWs singing after they've learned of the end of hostilities against Italy by the US in 1943. You can see their uniform there. It says PW on each sleeve and then also on the legs of the pants. The image on the right is really interesting. This is a picture postcard of a German prisoner of war, and doesn't have much information on it. It does have his name, and it is addressed to someone in Germany. So we think he sent this back to a family member or a friend in Germany, just to kind of say, I'm here, I'm okay, this is me and my everyday clothes here in the camp. Prisoners were allowed to write letters. So you can see here, we have the front of a postcard that was sent back to Germany. We think probably from a young officer, perhaps to his father. And then the longer form letter on the left is actually sent from a German soldier to his aunt who lived in the Bronx in New York. We are fortunate to have on staff someone who is German ancestry and can read German, and we're able to know that these letters are very perfunctory, nothing that worries the censor. They tell their family members that they're okay in camp and that it's very warm, which is not a surprise if you have ever been to the Sandhills of Georgia. And here we have a band of the prisoners, just to give you another sense of recreational activities. And there on the right, we have 3 of the US officers kind of going through this democracy curriculum there. So US troops did not become integrated until 1948. And as you might imagine, having an army post in the Jim Crow South presented its fair share of issues at time. The last recorded lynching in Muskogee County, where Columbus is located, actually took place on Fort Benning, which is kind of shares land with Muskogee County and Chattahoochee County. Private Felix Hall was found murdered in the woods on Fort Benning in 1941, and his killer or killers were never found or brought to justice. So there's a very racially charged atmosphere there at the time. You can see there on the left, this is a kitchen mess tent for African American soldiers. Many African Americans did menial tasks as part of their Army service. So for example, cooking or construction. Here on the right, this is a really interesting image. This is a posed PR shot, but these are Mexican American soldiers who are gathered together to sing at the end of training. You can see they all have their rifles with bayonets there. I don't know how many times do you take your bayoneted rifle to sing at the end of a long day, especially when you're just in training. But again, it kind of shares this vision of one America, we're all in this together, everyone does their part, that the Army and the US government really wanted to promote and share during World War II. So Columbus plays a role in trying to negotiate these complicated race relations as well. This is an image of E.E. Farley there on the right, as well as another local African-American leader who are members of the Social Civic 25 Club, which is a precursor to the NAACP in Columbus. And they are meeting with top leadership at Fort Benning, trying to talk about ways to improve race relations. Folks in Columbus realized, especially African Americans, realized that this was part of the important role that they could play in welcoming troops to Columbus, especially Black service members who may not have grown up in the South and might have not been used to the rather overt and oftentimes more violent racism and segregation that they faced in the South. Than if they had grown up in the North or the West, where oftentimes those forms of intimidation might have been more subtle. This is an image that you actually see a lot. It pops up a lot in historical articles and in some documentaries. You see this is MP who is set up to go out and patrol, but it's actually credited to Columbus. This is Columbus, Georgia image of an MP, an African-American MP from Fort Benning. So this gives you a sense of really the nearly total segregation that was common in the Army then and would have extended into the community. So this also included Columbus wanted to be as welcoming as possible, as I mentioned earlier. So there are USOs and YMCAs that are available to help entertain these young men and help them feel closer to home. So at the beginning of World War II, Black business and community leaders in Columbus raised money for a USO, and they hire A.J. McClung, who had previously helped to run, worked with some other community initiatives. And he is pictured there on the left in this image. This was a very vibrant center of activity. It was really one of the few places where African American service members could leave post, come into Columbus, and find hospitality, warmth, and know that they were safe in this space. So as I mentioned, Columbus wanted to be very welcoming. This is a great image from the Library of Congress, kind of directing soldiers just getting off a bus, like, hey, are you looking for the YMCA? Here, go this way. It's just down the street this way. And alongside that, there are efforts to provide places to stay for women who are coming to visit their soldiers who are stationed at Fort Benning. There had been many officers who had lived at Fort Benning during their 20s and 30s who had wives and young families with them. But in this instance, for the first time, we're really seeing this huge influx of folks who are stationed at Fort Benning for a few months, maybe for a year or so, and they don't have the option of having their family members with them. But their mothers, their wives, their girlfriends, their sisters, and the rest of their family are still able to visit them. So these USO clubs or Army Wives clubs spring up, and they are designed to be temporary housing for when these women, especially young women who might potentially be unmarried or newly married, it's a safe place for them to come, and there is no worry of impropriety with this lodging. This is absolutely safe lodging, no question, women only, a safe place to be. So just like Fort Benning, Columbus undergoes a huge infrastructure boom as a result of the buildup of Fort Benning and World War II. There's new housing construction, a new city sewer system, a new airport. For the first time, a 4-lane highway is built between Columbus and Fort Benning. And to top it all off, right at the end of the war in the summer of 1945, the city doubled in size through annexation. So there on the left, we have an image of Newton D. Baker Village, which was named for a cabinet secretary at that time involved with the war effort. And if you can read the sign, it says this project is part of the Defense Housing Program of the United States Housing Authority. Baker Village actually became a longtime public housing community for service members who were stationed at Fort Benning. Columbus has its industrial roots as a mill town, and that textile production and also iron production only increased during World War II. Many people, especially people from rural Georgia and Alabama, as well as the panhandle of Florida, chose to move to Columbus during this time because there was steady work in the mills and other industries here. Wartime production employed nearly 20,000 people, and local mills devoted as much as half of their manufacturing capacity towards the war effort. They made clothing, blankets, towels, belts, tire cords, suspenders, knapsacks, handkerchiefs, you name it, they probably made it, uniform pieces, armor components, as well as not just textiles. Just for some perspective, textile mills in Columbus, though, employed more than 14,000 people in 1943 and used more than 6,000 bales of cotton per week. And if you've ever seen a bale of cotton, you know that is no small amount of cotton. So here are some images of the building boom. These are really great images taken by Marion Post Wolcott, who was a U.S. government photographer. And so we see part of the early building of Baker Village. Here you can see it's been a little rainy, a little muddy. Really gives you an idea of how isolated it would have been at that time. And you have these trailer parks that spring up and these grocery stores that spring up to cater to them. See here, trailer park, shower, bath, water, light, yay, all good services. There's also an itinerant photographer stand there on the right. You can see, I think you get 3 photos for 10 cents, which sounds like a bargain to me. Madame Marie I'm sure she was very busy, especially with many of these young men who were preparing to go off to war. They might be seeking to find out what lay ahead for them in their future. Again, the Manum has a very simple trailer. This is a trailer lived in by a construction worker who was helping to build all this housing, rented for just a couple dollars a week. And these are men who chose to live in a boarding house. Their rent was $6 a week, I believe, and they came from all over Georgia to help serve on these construction projects. And here is one of these finished projects, again, kind of out by itself. These are children of a soldier stationed at Fort Benning and their dog. There's also a lot of people who come to Columbus and Fort Benning looking for work during this time, not just at the mills, but at the post itself. So the picture there and the center bottom is from the World War II Museum. It's women working in the telephone office at Fort Benning. And the 2 ID badges you see there are from the collection of the Columbus Museum. We don't know anything about the man on the right, unfortunately. We do know that the woman on the left came here from Pennsylvania, we believe. So again, it's not just the service members driving this, it is folks coming looking for work on post as well as civilians. So Columbus folks wanted to be helpful in a variety of ways. One example is they form a chapter of the Civil Air Patrol, which is part of these civil defense units that spring up around the country that are supposed to help partially in kind of a Red Cross, civic preparedness capacity, helping with first aid, basic skills there, helping to pick up the slack for folks who have enlisted in the military and are gone, and also potentially preparing for a potential invasion by German or Japanese forces, which is especially where the Civil Air Patrol comes into play. Being able to identify enemy aircraft or US or British or other friendly aircraft, and utilizing aircraft that people might have owned to help fly first aid missions or help to transport service members domestically. So these are a couple pictures of members of the Civil Air Patrol chapter here in Columbus. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, recreation and hospitality were huge factors. So these are billboards that you might see as you were driving out of post towards Columbus. Chancellor Company in particular had a long time association with serving the military, both in selling uniform pieces, but also just nice suits and supporting the troops that were stationed here. So again, the business community of Columbus, just as it had dreamed all those years ago, it really wants to open its arms and its doors wide to the folks of Fort Benning. So folks who were here for any length of time very quickly took the bus, or if they were lucky enough to know someone with a car, came to downtown Columbus. The picture you see here says Main Street, but the main street, the main drag of Columbus, if you will, is actually called Broadway. So this is an image of Broadway there. And it would have had several stores like this one, a military supply store, chevrons, caps, and garrison belts. So again, it's helping you kind of supply your uniform. There may be some trinkets there that you can send to your family members or friends back home. Or maybe you really want to get a tattoo. I think these gentlemen are considering very closely what tattoo might suit them best. These are really great images taken by another U.S. government photographer, Jack Delano, available through the Library of Congress. So here's a sergeant with his young son getting a haircut in a Columbus barber shop. We have men lined up to take the Greyhound. I know it's very unusual right now to see this. You want to tell them to be 6 feet apart, but to really give you a sense of how crowded it was with these men seeking to travel home or to Atlanta or to Birmingham for the weekend. There's a picture of the inside of the ticket office. That's a lot of folks, and most of them are Army. If you didn't get to go home, maybe you just explored downtown, you loitered, as these gentlemen are doing there on the left. This gives me a chance to share one of my favorite historical coincidences. Some of you may remember a few years ago, this meme went around featuring Chris Maloney of Law and Order SVU, posing very nicely during the middle of filming in Central Park, just casually taking a break, using a light post. However, he is not the first man to casually take a break using a light post, as you can see from this shot of a service member during World War II in downtown Columbus. So men, light post, it's the best posing prop, perhaps. And as you might imagine, many of these young men found young women to spend time with. Some of these relationships became quite serious. Columbus became known as the mother-in-law of the Army, a title that it still holds in many ways to this day. This couple is strolling down a side street downtown. I love her hat. It's perfectly positioned. Now, if you're looking for some more rowdy time with your boys, you might go to a country store and enjoy a little game there. You can see these gentlemen enjoying that. This is over on the Alabama side of the river. Or you might go to a shooting gallery at Idlehour Park near Phoenix City, Alabama. You can see this man putting his training to good use. Seems a little unfair to any civilians there shooting that day. Or you might take a swing by the pool. Now, it should be noted that Phoenix City was notorious for its gambling dens and houses of ill repute, shall we say, of many ill reputes. And General George Patton, when he was stationed at Columbus, famously threatened to roll over and flatten Phoenix City with his tanks. He was so frustrated with the trouble that many of his soldiers got into there. Idlehour Park, however, a little more family friendly, as you can see here. And of course, we have MPs in Columbus and Phoenix City helping to patrol. An interesting organization that was unique to Columbus was the Military Maids. This was a group of about 500 teenage girls who worked with 40 women chaperones. And they helped throw teas and dances for young soldiers. Now, I know what you might be thinking, why are teenage girls dancing with 18 to 24-year-old men? Well, for one thing, this is where the chaperones come into play. Also, a report in 1942 actually identified that juvenile delinquency among America's youth was quickly becoming a consequence of the war. And it specifically noted concerns about young girls between the ages of 13 and 15. So the Military Maids in this report, in this federal report, was actually cited as an example of a solid program that helped to boost the war effort, boost the morale of soldiers serving their country, but also provided a safe, healthy, fun, and supervised outlet for these young girls who were considered to be potentially in trouble. And finally, there are a number of famous faces who came through Columbus. One of the most famous of these was Betty Davis. She had a friend who was stationed at Fort Benning, and so she came to visit him a few times, met military leaders there, attended the Georgia-Auburn football game that took place in Columbus for many years. The actress Jane Russell also lived in Columbus for a while. This is the house that she lived in. She had a husband who was stationed here, so The two of them moved here together, and then after he left and moved on to other training, she remained here for a few more months after that. And of all the famous military leaders who have served at Fort Benning, some of the most famous came during World War II. General Dwight Eisenhower visited here. Actually, he had served here as a younger officer in the 1920s when he helped coach the football team. General George Patton, I mentioned earlier, was famously here, helped oversee the armor school and armor training that took place here. And General Omar Bradley was also stationed here at the beginning of World War II. So what happens after World War II? Well, we've built up all this infrastructure, so it's very clear that Fort Benning is going to remain a very important post for the U.S. Army. As I mentioned, it is desegregated due to federal orders in 1948. Again, this is long before meaningful desegregation begins in Columbus. So that leads to some interesting tensions, but also some signs of progress. In addition to the Airborne School, where about 14,000 soldiers still train annually to this day, Fort Benning is probably best known as one of the primary sites for Army Ranger training that started here in 1950, so just a few years after the war. Fort Benning is now home to the Maneuver Center of Excellence, which contains both the Infantry School and the Armor Schools. There are approximately 28,000 active duty soldiers stationed here, and the total population of Fort Benning, including active duty soldiers, dependents, and retirees, is considered to be about 107,000 people. I really love this image on the right. This is from the Columbus Museum's collection. It is supposed to be showing a soldier suit of the future. This is from a 1961 magazine that will help to protect you from radiation. You can see the jump tower and the parachutes there in the background. So theoretically, this is what a Cold War paratrooper might have worn if the need arose to be protected from a serious radiation blast. This suit never came to fruition, of course, but I do like to include it. I think it speaks to the fact that Fort Benning has, for a long time, considered to be at the forefront of the Army and what comes next, and that really continues to this day. And Columbus and Phoenix City have continued to be very supportive of that mission. So that's our presentation for today. If you're watching this, you're probably already familiar with the National World War II Museum, which is a fantastic institution with wonderful collections. However, if you have family artifacts or photos specifically related to Columbus or Fort Benning that you might like to share with a more local audience, you can contact me at the Columbus Museum. My email and phone number are there. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out and contact me as well. I have really enjoyed being able to speak with you today, and I hope you learned a little something new about Columbus and Fort Benning during World War II that you didn't know before. Thank you so much.